Hei og velkommen til Kilden Teater- og Konserthus. Vi ufattelig glad for at Norsk Publikumsutvikling har lagt årskonferansen sin her til oss, og veldig glad for at Arena Usus også har lagt sin høstkonferanse hit nå. Jeg heter Birgit Amalie Nilsen. Jeg sjef for avdeling Agder Teater ved Kilden. Dette huset rommer Agder Teater, Opera Sør, Kristiansand Symfoniorkester og Kilden Kulturdrift, som kulturhusbiten av vår virksomhet. Jeg understudy i dag for Hans Antonsen, som vår nye påtroppende direktør, som dessverre var forhindret fra å møte. Akkurat i disse dager en av våre produksjoner ute på veien og spiller for 24 000 skolebarn, og i introduksjonen deres så står det: «Hvis ikke du hadde vært her, så hadde ikke vi vært her heller.» Sånn det med alt det vi driver med. Hvis ikke det sitter folk i salen, så ikke det vi holder på med teater. Derfor spiller alltid publikum hovedrollen i våre produksjoner. Vi kunne ha drevet med forskning uten de, men vi kunne ikke ha drevet med scenekunst. Derfor vi så glad for at Norsk Publikumsutvikling finnes og kan fortelle oss hvordan vi kan nå stadig flere. Vi håper at både NPU og Arena Usus får en fantastisk konferanse hos oss. Hjertelig velkommen og kos dere.
Ja, god formiddag alle sammen. Mitt navn Reidar Fuglestad. Til daglig i Dyreparken, men jeg også her som styreleder i Arena Usus. Og denne dagen, eller disse 2 dagene, de har jeg virkelig gledet meg til. For en anledning til å lære noe nytt. Når altså vi møtes med Norsk Publikumsutviklings årskonferanse og Usus sin høstkonferanse, det gir perspektiv kompetansemessig. Jeg brenner for kultur og næring. Usus brenner for kultur og næring og har jobbet med dette i lang tid. Denne anledningen allikevel til å bli kjent med helt nye kompetanseområder som først og fremst Norsk Publikumsutvikling representerer for meg. Og dere har mange deltakere her i dag, og jeg gleder meg til å bli kjent med dere. Og jeg oppfordrer hver enkelt til å bruke denne anledningen til å bli kjent med de nye, kjent med noen som de ikke har møtt før, kjent med det nye kompetanseområdet. For jeg helt sikker på at summen av den kraft som i denne salen her, det gir oss fremtidsmuligheter for å utvikle oss videre. Det jeg helt sikker på, og det skal vi oppdage i løpet av disse 2 dagene. Og for min del så jeg altså opptatt av kultur og næring, og i morgen så har vi altså et seminar som går på hvordan skal vi nå frem til det internasjonale publikum. Og der har vi i Arena Usus mye å lære av Norsk Publikumsutvikling, så jeg tror det blir en veldig spennende sesjon. Jeg skal være der selv selvfølgelig, så jeg håper at mange kommer der. Og jeg har bare lyst til å si hjertelig velkommen, og til lykke med konferansen. Bruk anledningen dere har. Det opp til hver enkelt av oss å bli klokere i løpet av disse 2 dagene. Takk skal du ha.
Hei alle sammen. Hjertelig velkommen til årskonferansen. Jeg heter Silje Gripsrud, og jeg representerer da NPU sitt styre. Jeg synes det helt fantastisk at det så mange som har meldt seg på. Det 285 deltakere, og hele 200 har kommet tilreisende. Så det vitner jo om et stort og brennende engasjement for det vi holder på med. NPU har 148 medlemmer, og 100 av disse driver med publikumsrettet arbeid. Men vi har også med oss fylkeskommuner og kommuner og ulike nettverks- og paraplyorganisasjoner. Og til sammen så utgjør jo dette et verdifullt og tverrfaglig nettverk. Vi har også styrket kontakten med forskningsmiljøer og kunstutdanningene, som vi synes veldig viktig. NPU skal jo være et kompetansesenter som skal samle og initiere og spre kunnskap. Og når vi samlet sånn som dette, så håper jeg at vi får lært mye av hverandre. For i løpet av disse dagene så får vi jo mange ulike perspektiver på hva publikumsutvikling egentlig Det jo et litt omdiskutert begrep. Vi får også se og lære mer om ulike konkrete eksempler på prosjekter, For det handler jo også om hvordan du skal omsette strategier og visjoner og disse flotte ordene ned til helt konkrete ting som vi jobber med til daglig. Det som jeg synes er viktig er at publikumsutvikling handler jo egentlig ikke om å utvikle publikum. Det handler om at kulturfeltet skal utvikle seg, at vi skal utvikle oss. Og det handler om å skape et økt kunstnerisk handlingsrom, det handler om å skape relasjoner og tillit. Og det handler om å styrke kunstens posisjon i samfunnet, og også på en måte skape den forankringen som vi er opptatt av. Og rett og slett få frem hvorfor er kunst og kultur viktig, hvorfor ønsker vi oss et stort og mangfoldig og engasjert publikum. Det handler ikke om å ha fokus. Vi har litt fokus på det, men det handler ikke først og fremst å ha fokus på publikumstellinger og økte salgstall, men det handler om den relasjonen og det å forankre det, og også å skape spennende kunstneriske uttrykk ved å involvere publikum og folk som er der ute. At vi ikke blir en liten boble som er avhengig av at folk tenker, ja, de får holde på med sitt. Vi skal være en del av det samfunnet som vi opererer i. Og da vil jeg egentlig bare introdusere Ingrid Handeland, som er direktør for NPU. Hun har satt sammen et veldig spennende konferanseprogram som vi har foran oss. Og jeg tenker at også mye av hennes innsats, hun har vært veldig mye rundt og holdt foredrag og snakket og vært med i ulike klynger og alt sånt, som har skapt det store engasjementet som vi ser rundt omkring, og som dette deltakerantallet vittner om. Ingrid, er du bak der? Ja. Og så må jeg ønske dere en god fornøyelse.
Takk. Det var jo veldig hyggelige ord. Kjære medlemmer, kjære USUS-folk, ærede publikum. Årets tema «Kjenn ditt publikum» henspeiler jo på det faktum at publikumsutvikling er relasjonsbygging. Og jeg har tenkt å snakke litt om fordommer, det kommer vi til å snakke om mye i denne konferansen, og også på den sesjonen som jeg leder i morgen. Vi møter jo hverandre alltid med fordommer. Og sånn som jeg ser det, så er det ikke noe umoralsk ved fordommer i utgangspunktet. Det er rett og slett sånn hjernen vår opererer. Vi danner oss inntrykk av folks personlighet i løpet av sekunder, på bakgrunn av alder, kjønn, klesstil, språk, kroppsholdning, og vi plasserer dem umiddelbart i ulike kategorier. Og de kategoriene vi plasserer dem i er jo selvfølgelig ikke objektive kriterier. Det er bokser og strukturer i hodene våre som formes kulturelt og som kan utfordres. Vi er alle barn av vår tid, av vår klasse, av vårt miljø, og denne tilhørigheten gir oss noen bestemte måter å forstå verden på. Sånn sett så er vi alle fordomsfulle i utgangspunktet. Fordommer kan endres, men da må de aktivt utfordres. Fordommer om barn og unge, om gamle, om skeive, om utlendinger, om flyktninger. Kort og godt fordommer om de andre. Det er veldig strevsomt å motstå sine egne fordommer. Å utsette seg for kunst er blant annet å la sine fordommer utfordres. Mange unngår å utsette seg for denne utfordringen. Publikumsutvikling for kunst handler derfor blant annet om å inspirere folk til å utfordre sin egen fordom om at kunst er krevende og lite underholdende. Jeg synes kunst kan være svært underholdende. Faktum er at mange av de som ikke bruker de kunstinstitusjonene vi har en ganske inngrodd fordom at det er rett og slett for krevende. Noen ganger er det krevende. Det er i hvert fall ingen liten utfordring å bygge publikum, altså få inn nye brukere når den fordommen er såpass inngrodd. Der har vi en felles jobb å gjøre. Alle kulturinstitusjoner jakter på de unge med åpne sinn. Mange har et litt sånn hat-elsk-forhold til kulturkjæringen. Det begrepet er jo ikke spesielt fantastisk, vakkert. Vi snakker altså om de som kjøper flest billetter. Det er et begrep som Agder-forskning for øvrig coina i 2012. Det er altså 50-pluss-damen som kjøper de fleste billettene, og som vi av og til nesten skammer oss over å ha for mange i salen. Et raskt blikk på statistikkene, og en første presentasjon kommer til å se litt på det, viser at befolkningen blir jo bare eldre og eldre. Så dersom alle medlemmene i NPU lykkes i å senke gjennomsnittsalderen, som et mål for veldig mange, så det veldig mange i dette landet som ikke har noe kulturtilbud i fremtiden. Utfordringen bør kanskje heller være å utvikle relasjonene til andre godt voksne enn den klassiske kulturkjæringen, gjerne på solsiden med akademisk utdannelse og politisk korrekte holdninger. Hva med godt voksne menn uten akademisk utdannelse? Har de noen plass i kulturinstitusjonen? Hvilke fordommer har vi om de? Hvem jakter på dem? I Performa-prosjektet, som vi skal legge fram i morgen, så har vi gjennomført samtaler med såkalte ikke-brukere av performativ kunst i Oslo. Jeg må bare si med en gang, det eksisterer ikke en eneste ikke-bruker i virkeligheten der ute. Ikke-brukere er et helt pragmatisk begrep som vi har satt, og det betyr noen som ikke har vært på disse institusjonene de siste 5 årene. Men for å økonomisere med språk så kaller vi de ikke-brukere. Internt. Jeg vil aldri anbefale noen å gå ut og si «Kjære ikke-bruker, kom på besøk», men altså det fungerer i denne sammenheng. En av de mest overraskende funnene der er at faktisk mannlige ikke-brukere som ble dratt inn i prosjektet mer eller mindre mot sin vilje, de ble betalt for å komme og se forestillinger og høre konserter og så videre, og så snakket vi med de før og etter og så forskjellen i inntrykk de hadde. En av de mer interessante tingene var at det faktisk viser seg at blant disse mennene så er det veldig påfallende stor interesse for samtidsdans. Det er kanskje ny empiri, hva vet jeg. Vi synes det var veldig festlig. Disse folkene er anonymisert, men vi har med oss ikke-brukeren Birger. Jeg vet ikke om dere har fått med dere det, men vi har da en mann i skyen som heter Birger. Han er en stolt ikke-bruker av offentlig finansiert kunst og kultur. Og han har rett og slett overtatt våre sosiale medier under denne konferansen. Det heter vel gjerne å bli face-raper. Vi har altså da gjort det med vilje. Jeg kan ikke innstå for hva Birger holder på med, men jeg kan anbefale å følge ham på Twitter og Facebook. Han skal for øvrig befinne seg her et eller annet sted. Jeg tror han er på vei inn. Jeg håper han er på plass i hvert fall. Så jeg vet ikke, Birger. Hvordan går det? Har du kommet?
Er det noen som vet hvor jeg kan få validert parkeringsbilletten min, Hanna?
Nei. Hæ?
Ikke det, nei. Nei, ok. Nei, hva? Vent litt. Du, jeg holdt på å glemme at jeg skal jo faktisk... Jeg skal faktisk ønske velkommen her i dag til Kilden. Det har seg nemlig sånn at jeg ble invitert ned hit til Kristiansund for å analysere da NPU sin årskonferanse. For å være helt ærlig så hadde jeg heller lyst til å bruke tiden min på å se repriser og Mot i brøstet på TV2 Humor. Men så de til meg at Trudy Dreveland skulle komme og åpne konferansen, og da måtte jo jeg komme. Men nå ser jo jeg at det var jo ikke Trudy som åpnet konferansen. Så denne her årskonferansen begynner å ligne en skandale, Ingrid. Og det er jo nesten før han i det hele tatt er begynt.
Ja.
Så nå krysser jeg fingrene og håper at i alle fall Herman Friele er en av de andre foredragsholderne. Ellers så blir jo dette bedagelige greier. Men nå er det vel bare å ønske lykke til. Herfra kan du vel strengt tatt bare gå én vei.
Dette er altså da mine fordommer om ikke-brukere, som er da animert for øvrig. Han er jo selvfølgelig en parodi, men det er jo gøy. Anyways. Det første vi skal gå inn i rent faglig i dag, det er generasjonsstudier og generasjoner relatert til kulturbruk. Det første panelet, i dette panelet så skal vi møte 3 ulike forskere som alle har investert mye tid i å forstå publikumssegmenter. Vi har også da invitert Arthur Cohen fra La Placa Cohen i New York, Stuart Knapman fra The Sound i London, og Gunhild Hagestad fra Birkeland. som har bodd og arbeidet et helt liv som sosiolog i USA. Vi gleder oss til å få utfordret våre fordommer om unge og gamle, og hvilket forhold de har til kunst og kultur. Etter hvert som de har presentert, så tar de plass i sofaen, og det modereres en samtale med dem ved Kirsti Mathisen Hjemdal. God fornøyelse!
Good morning, everybody. I'm Arthur Cohen. I've come from New York. I've traveled very far, and I'm going to talk very fast. I'm sorry. I decided I needed to give you a lot of information instead of just a little bit, so the time is compressed. I apologize for going quickly, but I hope what you'll do as you see this data, which comes from the US, is be thinking of all the points of convergence and consistency with the Norwegian experience and where you think it's different. So in a nutshell, I'm going to present to you today with the study that my firm does, which is the largest study about cultural consumers in the United States. It's called Culture Track. What it is, essentially, it's a tracking study, and by that I mean it's a study where we ask a similar population, a similar group of questions over different points in time. And the cool thing about a tracking study is the insights come not only from what you learn at any one moment, but in seeing the shifts from year to year and how rapidly certain things change. And this last time we did it, which is in 2014, some of the changes in cultural behavior were really startling in terms of their speed. Effectively, what we look at are the attitudes, the motivators, and behaviors of what we call culturally active US audiences. And I will give you a very specific definition for it, starting with a traditional definition, and then going into a definition that is really generated from the audience themselves. Our work is always biased towards the audience. We consider our practice to be an outside-in practice, which is to say that with many of the cultural organizations who are our clients, which include places like the Metropolitan Opera, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and many others, what we first try to do is help them understand what's happening in the world around them so that when they are thinking about their offer, their points of connection with the audience, they can have a very clear sense in mind of who they're talking to. So why we do this study, first off, there's a lot of, in the US and UK and others, these are just 4 quick examples, there are a lot of very, very good, robust studies that look at cultural audience behaviors on an ongoing basis. However, when we sit down with clients and look at these studies, we find that there's a lot of what and not a lot of why. Essentially what these studies do is they're very, very good at giving you a picture at a moment in time, but we try to get to a level behind it and say, the phrase we use is what is in the hearts and minds of cultural consumers that expresses themselves in the kind of data that you see in some of these studies. For example, at least in the US, there's a number of trends that a lot of people talk about in culture, such as a search for authenticity, the fact that cultural organizations are presenters and guardians of the real thing, and in an increasingly digital age, there's an appetite for that. Well, that's interesting, it's probably true, but I don't know what you do with it, for example, if you're about to create a marketing plan or a strategic plan. This tendency towards self-curation, again, born of technology, all of us creating our own iPod playlists and everything. So that's interesting as well, but where does it come from? And this term that we use, collaborative consumption, which is really interesting, and essentially the notion that we believe very strongly in the US, is that as we become physically more disconnected from each other because of technology, there is a counter trend to seek out opportunities where we can consume things together, even if it is in the company of strangers. And that's a very strong counterbalance to a lot of things that we see in terms of people being glued to screens. But again, what's driving that and what's behind it? So that's what we're trying to find out. So in terms of understanding today's audiences, if I were writing a story or a short novel about the US audience, at least today for culture, what are some of the words I might use? Well, first of all, I would ask them a couple key questions. Not only what are you doing, what activities are you engaging in, but how are you engaging in them? How often do you go? What kind of social or family unit accompanies you, if any? And what are the other dynamics of the visit? And most importantly, why? What is the role that culture plays in your life? This is the most elusive, and to us, it's the gold standard. The closer you come to answering this question, the more attuned you will be to what your audience wants and needs from you as a cultural organization. So in terms of some background, because there's probably some research people, are there research people in the room, people who do market research? No? All right, we're gonna open an office in Oslo, and then you can call us, but Essentially, this is the biggest study in the United States. It statistically mirrors the US population. We talked to over 4,000 people online in all 50 US states. And that little number at the bottom, that 1.6% margin of error, that means that no number I show you can vary above or below that. And that's a very, very small number. For example, in the polls that are done this year, which is a crazy election year in the United States, do not get me started. The typical margin of error in a political poll is about 3.5%, so this is a much more rigorous sampling. The only thing you have to remember are 4 cute little codes here, X, M, B, and P, which I will now define. So the first group is millennials, which some of you, who has not heard of millennials before? Okay, so, oh, you haven't? Welcome. In the US, they want to throw something at me because we're talking about them too much. But millennials tend to be the kind of dream date for the cultural organizations in a lot of other parts of the world, which is to say this is where a lot of resources are focused. These are people generally just out of college who are starting their behavior patterns in terms of the things they like and do in culture, hopefully patterns that will stay with them all their lives. So they're from 18 to 29 years old. Then Gen X's, which is the next age group from 30 to 49. Boomers, baby boomers, who are 50 to 69. And the next group, which I have a lot to say about, and the reason I have a lot to say about them is because they are completely neglected and they don't even have a name. So we gave them a name. We call them pre-wars. These are people who are 70 or older, people born up until about 1944 or 1945. And I'm going to come back to them because they are of particular interest. So what did we learn? Well, what we learned is that if you look at least in the US and you say, is it a good time to be in the culture business? Is the market robust? What you can say is yes. At least in the US, whenever you define cultural participation in a traditional sense, it means that someone has done one of these things at least once in the past 12 months. And these are the typical categories, ranging from a term that we call living museums, which in the US, that means where something is literally alive, something like a botanic garden or a zoo. And it's not surprising that that's always the largest share of market because people who go in family units with children. So the numbers are there. And so what you see is anytime you see a pink bar in this presentation, that's this year's study. And anytime you see the gray bar, that's 3 years ago. So obviously anytime the pink is bigger than the gray, you see an increase in participation. So on all of these art forms in the US, it's a very robust and active market where we've seen a statistically significant increase in participation. Take a look at musical theater, because there's a nice little story I can tell you right away. See how there's that nice uptick from 49 to 52? Dramatic theater saw the opposite direction. Why? And this is why numbers always are great pathways into amazing stories. Why? Why is because everyone is really stressed out in my country, and there's a lot of interest in using culture as an escape, using culture as a portal to feel better. And one of the ways that manifested itself in this past study is that we saw that the kind of plays and shows that were uplifting and fun saw an uptick, whereas the hard stuff, what we call straight plays, heavy drama and theater, actually saw a decline. So people are opting in or opting out based on content because of their emotional needs, right from the beginning. And that's interesting, right? I think it is. So that sounds pretty good, but this is where the trouble starts. So this is a boring chart, and they will get more interesting visually, by the way, as we go on. But essentially, as you move from where I'm standing to the far end of the stage, this is about frequency of participation. And in this case, we have this year at the top, and then the last 3 years ago in the middle, and about 7 years ago at the bottom. And this is what freaks my clients out. The fact that in 7 years, we have lost half of the people who drive the market, from 31% to 15% of people who attend culture 3 or more times a month. These are subscribers, these are members, these are donors, these are the people who you tend to also monetize the highest. That is to say, they make the greatest financial contribution to culture. And so this is very worrisome because it means that we have a half as many in that pool of frequent users or heavy goers than we did just 7 years ago, and that's a really big number. So how does this work out in terms of age group. Remember our 4 little codes? Well, let's take a look. Culture, at least in the US, is a sandwich. See? The bread at the top and the bottom, and I just took away the ham and cheese. So essentially, what this means is that number of times per month, the millennials, those 18 to 29s, attend most, but they are very closely followed by pre-wars, which makes perfect sense because pre-wars have a number of shared characteristics regardless of whether you're in Norway or the US. They're older, they've experienced culture as a part of their lives much more regularly, and they have more leisure time and often more disposable income. So it's not surprising that they follow the youngest audience in terms of frequency of participation. What is surprising is how much they are ignored by the very organizations they patronize. This is part of, when I talked about like going to happy stuff instead of sad stuff, part of the reason is this. This is super surprising. Our question was simply, among the reasons that you are participating in culture less, where does economic factors lie in? And what we saw is an increase. Even though in the US, we have almost completely rebounded from the Great Recession, we see an increase in people saying that they are continuing to reduce expenses across the board, therefore they are going to culture less. In the US, we call this the Consumer Confidence Index, and essentially what that means in economics terms is you don't buy something based on how much money you have in the bank, you buy something based on your confidence in the future and your sense that things are moving in a direction where you're comfortable spending. And in the US, there's still a lot of shakiness, a lack in confidence that expresses itself in a number of ways, and one of the ways it expresses itself is 82% of the people we spoke to, more than 8 out of 10, say they are continuing to participate in culture less because of economic worries. Now, this is where I think it starts to get super interesting. We get away from the traditional definitions of culture where you say, did you go to a museum, did you go to an opera, et cetera, and we give people a huge list of possible things they can be doing with their free time, and we ask them a very simple question. Which of these things are culture to you? On par with going to a museum, a theater, or an opera. And in the US, these are the ones that rose to the top. Going to a national, state, or municipal park. 8 out of 10 people said when they're going to a park, they're having a cultural experience, and almost all of them, almost 90% said they do. Why does this matter? This matters, for example, if you are creating a new cultural space. If you think that your cultural programming space ends with the walls of your museum or opera house or library, you're wrong. The audience sees cultural space as all the green, all the park, all the public around it. And the more that you can do to dissolve the boundary between interior and exterior, the more you meet audiences where they are because they see all of that as art space. So, for example, one of the most successful exhibitions we worked in this past year was at the largest botanic garden in the US, the New York Botanical Garden, where they created a show called Frida Kahlo's Garden and recreated essentially the backdrops of many Frida Kahlo's paintings and brought real paintings in, and food, and all this other stuff. And it was massive. If they thought they would get 400,000 people, so far they've gotten 800,000 people. And it's because they are pushing out, we call this the garden as gallery, the idea that outdoor space is now program space to your audience. Similarly, high-definition broadcasts of opera, such as the Met HD Live, for people who are going to this in their local movie theater, they're not going to a movie, they're going to the opera. They are having a cultural experience, and 2/3 of them say that's culture, and 1/3 of them has done it in the past year. Participating in street art with our famous Banksy here, the idea of seeing art on the street or encountering art, 2/3 of the people we talked to said, I am having a cultural moment when that is occurring, and almost as many participated. So, for example, one of the art museums we're working with, when they do an exhibition, they also commission the artist, if it's a contemporary artist, to create works on local billboards around town, because that's all the gallery. They're enlivening the city and pushing the art experience out into the street, because that's where the audience is waiting for it. Food. Food has never been more important as culture. This is a picture of something in New York City called Smorgasburg, which happens in Williamsburg in Brooklyn. Get it? Smorgasburg. And when people go to something like this, where they're tasting craft beers and artisanal cheeses and local breads, 64% say that is a cultural experience, and almost everyone is doing it. Why does this matter to you? How's the food in your cafe? Is it a cultural experience? Do you think about it in terms of its quality and authenticity, the way that you think about what happens on your stage or in your galleries? Because if you don't, you are behind the game. When you think about food in a cultural space, there is no such thing as food service anymore. There's only culture being delivered through food and drink. And that's only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Finally, a live or recorded lecture online, like a TED Talk, about half of the people we spoke to said that that is culture. And an independent or art house film, not a commercial film, more than half of people said that when they're going to an art house film, they are experiencing culture. Finally, in the US, and I don't know if this is the case here, television has become hugely important because we have all this destination viewing, things like Downton Abbey and Game of Thrones. And as a friend of mine in Hollywood said, smart people in the United States now brag about watching television, and that's new and that's important. So partnerships with television stations, for example, or taking the video content that you're already generating and seeing if you can share it through these channels is a very interesting opportunity. So what motivates and what prevents people from participating in culture? Let me just get to this eye chart and then focus on this. If you can take away one thing from my lecture today, it is this. Every cultural experience is social before it is cultural or artistic or aesthetic. Social comes first. In the audience's mind, their primary objectives are entertainment and enjoyment, and then time out with my friends and family. And everything else follows. It's not to say that having aesthetic moments and intellectual enlightenment and all the things that we are proud about that we can do, it's not that they are not important, but they come after. The audience has to first be persuaded that it will be a socially rewarding experience before their minds can be open to all the intellectual and aesthetic and artistic enrichment which you offer. So if you use that as a guide to think about the quality, say, of the welcoming experience as people walk in, what is the tone, what's the mood, how do you structure your invitations and your offers to your audience so that they respond to that social need, I think it's very important to consider. So every so often we learn something that really surprised us, and every time we did this big post-it note. This one we can call the young and the stressed. So this is crazy. This simple chart is insane. Because what it means, and this is the first time we believe this has happened in modern history, the younger you are, the more stressed out you are, and the more you look to culture to ease that stress. Another way of looking at this chart, see that 73%? That means 3 out of every 4 millennials walking through your door have as a primary goal of the cultural experience to escape or relieve stress. The audience is not neutral. We presume that they are. We presume they're these empty vessels that sit in our seats or walk in our galleries and we're going to fill them up with culture. That is not true. The audience comes into our spaces filled with emotion, filled sometimes with anxiety, and it takes a lot just to get them to neutral, to bring them down so that they can open up to the experiences you want to have. And you're going to hear in Stuart's presentation after mine even more about what happens if we were to include a younger group, even younger than millennials, which has this very much going on as well. So again, this is really something because we never think about what's in the kind of emotional state of the audience when they're walking through. We think they're just ready to go, and it's not true. It's certainly not in the US. Millennials are particularly interesting in terms of how they use culture for social. And essentially, compared to every other group, almost half of millennials will not go to a cultural event if they can't go with somebody else. So as we say to our clients, you are never marketing to a millennial, you are always marketing to millennials, because they travel in packs. right? Millennials view culture so much as social that many of them, almost more than half, and we think next time we do it, it will be more than half. Right now it's less. Many of them will stay home if they can't find someone to go with. A completely different mindset, twice as many as any other age group. Now let's look at this neglected segment of the pre-wars. So when we ask them this question about barriers to cultural participation, we see this step ladder down in saying that the topic is unappealing. So to me, this is our fault. This is what happens when we have a fascination with appealing to young audiences and do so in a way that alienates the older audiences or makes them feel unwelcome. Almost 8 out of 10, 77% of these audiences who are 65 or older will not come because they don't feel they're invited or they don't feel that the topic is of interest to them. And as I said, I think a lot of that is our fault as people who create these cultural experiences. Just to put this in perspective, so there's 2 bars here in each one. The dark green is the United States and the lighter is the world. And simply to make the obvious point that 65 or older, this is the estimated population change through 2050. And if you look at the bottom, this came from the United Nations, you see that 65 pluses are the future. They are the fastest growing segment of the world population, of the US population, and I'll show you of the Norwegian population. In the US, for example, in about 2030, we will see a flip that previously the fastest growing segment were 18 and younger, but that's about to change. And then I found this chart just recently. This is Norway is green, and these are the projections of through 2030. Closer to me is 65 plus, further away is 80 plus. So right now in Norway, about 16% of your population is 65 plus, and by 2030 that number will be about 20%. So we ignore these people at our peril. It makes no sense. Are they just not cool enough? That's what I ask my clients. I'm sorry, is that person just not cool? I mean, do you realize that Laurie Anderson is over 65, Lou Reed was over 65, David Bowie is about to be 65? I mean, who are you thinking of? Right? It's crazy. All right, quick on technology. This is interesting, and this could go very deep, but I'm going to just try to glide through because everyone always asks us these questions. So let's just first look at what we call the installed base of devices. Smartphones, tablets, iPods, and MP3s. This was 3 years ago. That's what happened in 3 years. Insane, right? And desktop, obviously, is decline at the expense of mobile. So when we talk about technology policy for all our clients, we are just talking about mobile. Mobile's the future. I'm sorry, I hate to be so definitive and so boring. It's all about mobile. Everything else was a false start. It's mobile, okay? So, I know, I'm American, I'll just make these sweeping generalizations. So, if everything is about mobile, what are we doing with it, the cultural world? So that's the same numbers I just showed you. And then we ask a question, how many of you are using your mobile devices on site? And that's how many right now. And that has to change. The audience will make that change. The question is whether you will keep up with them, where you'll be providing mobile-rich content and experiences that enhance the on-site experience and enhance it in appropriate ways. I am not suggesting that we ask people to stand up with their, with their smartphone and take a picture in the middle of an opera. No. But we're talking about things that are uniquely available using the hardware that people carry with them. And the fact that this is this transitional moment, again, where the audience is leading the way. This picture is real, and it is terrifying, okay? So we consider this to be the selfie moment. And this is what's really important about mobile quickly. When we ask people, for those who are using mobile on site during culture, what they're doing, here is what they're doing now, and these numbers will continue to skyrocket. So what's really important is, and it makes total sense, you all do it, right? 2/3 of people are taking pictures, and almost half of them, while they're standing in your gallery, are sharing those pictures through social media or posting it, right? Why? Because mobile validates actual experience now. It is this weird truth that we haven't really done it until we've shared it. And that's how we use mobile. And that has so many implications for how welcoming, how accommodating, how realistic we are in acknowledging this habit that the audience is only going to be doing more and more while we shake our fists and say, you're messing up my beautiful moment. Okay? Audience loyalty is not very good news. Okay? These are the 4 worst words you'll ever see because I'm going to show you this. This is visual art subscriptions and memberships in the United States. Performing arts subscriptions 3 years ago. Anybody have any guess what will happen when I push the button and the pink comes up? Boom. Boom. I've had people cry at this slide. So, that looks scary. It is scary, but all it means is that these tools are made for a time that has now passed. And we need to create new loyalty tools for a new generation. So you can be scared of this, but that's roadkill. It just represents the reality that the world in which these kinds of things were created is not where the world is going. Giving. Bigger in the US perhaps than it is here because all of our clients are concerned with philanthropy because there is less reliance on government money and more on private sources. But giving isn't so bad, at least in the US, and these are higher numbers than any other place in the world, at least that we're aware of. Over 1 in 3 people say that they intend to make a charitable contribution to a cultural organization this past time we asked, and it's a little higher than the time before, so that's nice. And why do people give? They don't give first and foremost because they love art or the arts. They give to organizations that support the community and make a benefit or impact in their community. That is now the top reason. That and what we call affinity. I like you. You're an organization like me, I will support you. And you have to understand this because this is becoming bigger and bigger. All the foundations in our country are focusing now on community impact. What are you doing outside the walls of your arts establishment? What does this stuff all mean? It means a number of things. In terms of the difference in today's audience, I am optimistic, and I will be challenged. My optimism will be challenged, I think, in our conversation later. I believe that this is a great moment because even though a lot of the things that we used to view as the indicators of a healthy cultural market, like subscriptions and memberships, even though those look really scary, we have an entirely new audience led by millennials who are interested in anything, as long as it's an authentic moment, as long as it's a great experience. So they'll try an art form that they have no background in. They're open to being persuaded and being invited. And I think with that openness comes both a huge opportunity and also a great obligation to make sure that the events that we're presenting and the way we're presenting them have authenticity and emotional impact that make them really stand out and be unique from others in the market. So, we know that this is a self-focused market, and by that it simply means that people experience culture because they want to get something out of it. And as I told you before, what they want out of it first is a social benefit. We use this expression, busier than thou. There's this weird psychological effect, and I've read 3 papers on this, and I find it really fascinating. At least in the US, you ask someone how you're doing, and the first thing they'll say is, oh my God, I'm so busy. Well, it turns out there is social cachet associated with that. When they're saying, oh my God, I'm so busy, they're bragging. They're not complaining anymore. They're bragging. And that's weird. We're in this weird new stage where being busy, or sometimes it's called the new term busyness, where busyness is an indicator of your level of engagement, of where you are in society and the world. And that's something to consider too, because just getting people's attention when they are priding themselves on being busy is a whole new challenge. Hyperconnected. I love the fact that there is an amplifier effect, say through Facebook or through Instagram, when one person having a great experience at an artistic moment can share it with the world and immediately see the impact. And the role that the cultural organization plays in that process by being a partner to share or supersize that impact, that ripple effect, that's a brand new opportunity that is incredibly powerful. This is not a picture of a passive audience. This is a picture of an audience that is hungry for new experience. They're out in the world and they're looking for stuff to do. And again, I think all of that has a lot of opportunity as well. We use this term culturally promiscuous, and we use it intentionally, which is to say that it's meant to be provocative. The loyalty as we used to define it no longer exists, or it is on its way out. Instead, you have a promiscuous audience that can pick and choose anything, and will spend one night with a different cultural organization every other night, right? And you're not going to see them in the morning. They're gone. They're gone. They just leave their keys. The point is simply that this is a world in which it is so easy to pick and choose and to create your own cultural playlist. Spend a few minutes on your laptop or on your mobile device and you can plan out your whole week. And just don't expect that the way they've demonstrated loyalty before is the way they will in the future. They are intensely curious. If there's one good thing about the incredible exponential rise in the amount of information we all have access to through technology, it is that it makes us curious about a lot more things. Many more things are on our radar screen than they ever have been before. And again, to us, that opens up opportunities that weren't there before. Where do we think this is going? Well, there's a lot of people who rub crystal balls and say, this is what I think is going to happen. Each of these following slides is its own presentation, so this is just a quick final overview. So first of all, the primacy of social media. Social is only going to get bigger. It's only going to get more fluid. It's only going to connect us in new and more ways. And the question is, where are you, the cultural organization, in the social media process? Are people posting things on your Facebook wall? Are you participating and partnering with your visitors in the social media world? Or are you just standing by and crossing your fingers and watching it happen as a passive observer? Integrated mobile devices. We definitely see instances now of using mobile technology on site in a way that does not replace and does not intrude upon, but rather enhances the physical experience of culture. Redefine loyalty models. We work with the largest nonprofit theater in the United States, and our assignment for them is not to fix their subscription model, but to replace it. Where will it lead? And all of the examples we are looking at are not in the cultural world. They're all from other types of loyalty programs. So we're looking at things like airlines, and we're looking at things like all these other affinity programs, because that's where the answers are going to lie. The shifting attitude towards sponsorship. This is notion, and I didn't show you too many slides about it, but simply to say that audiences are okay with cultural sponsorship as long as they understand that it's helping them experience something that without that sponsorship they wouldn't have experienced, and it's something that's important to them. So it's okay. You know, we used to think that we had the rise of a lot of cynicism around sponsorship, but our research indicates that as long as the sponsor is neutral to positive, it's not someone coming with a lot of baggage, and they're making something possible that is important in your life, that potentially there are a lot of rewards for sponsorship. We also see a mixed-use future, which is to say that if I were creating a cultural space of the future, it would have visual arts, performing arts, gastronomy, dance, a garden. It would have everything, because our audience is multisensory. One of the little phrases we sometimes use when we're working with architects is that the more senses you ignite in the audience member, the more opportunities you have to win. Which is to say that when people experience things on a variety of senses, they have a greater sense of connection to the place that is generating those senses if they're positive and authentic. An expanded definition of culture. You saw some of those examples of gardens as galleries and going to independent films. The audience, again, is in front of us. If we stick to our traditional definition and just measure success against that, we will not wind up in a good place. But if we understand all the opportunities that come with a broader sense of audience-driven definition of culture, there are a huge number of potentials that I think we can leverage. Then this final slide I just threw in because I think it's so important. If you are working from the outside in, that is to say, if in the discussion about what kind of programs or spaces or experiences you want to create, you begin with a discussion about what's in the hearts and minds of the audience, that, for it to succeed, has to be an empathic gesture. You have to put yourself in the mind and the heart of the audience and see how you look from them. What we find the biggest mistake that cultural organizations make is they have inherited what we call a generative model. That's to say that because they can do something, they do it, and assume the audience will be there. Now, although I don't believe in having the audience curate cultural experiences, because that takes this point to a ridiculous extreme, I do believe that the way we deliver and execute on these experiences results in a better and more successful engagement if we look at it from a shared sense of what we're calling institutional empathy. Empathizing with the audience, understanding they're stressed out about money, understanding that 3 out of 4 millennials come to escape that stress and to be uplifted or to escape and to feel better. The more that you have those kind of emotional touchstones and markers in your head as you're thinking about not only the programs, but the marketing, the language, the images that you use on your website, the more that's informed by empathy, real empathy, the more successful you will be. If you want more information and you want to see all the guts of our study, which is hundreds and hundreds of pages and there are many versions of, you can visit our website, and we're happy to take any thoughts about it on our website as well. Thank you for your time.
Hello. Hi. I'm Stuart. I'm from The Sound. We're a qualitative research and strategy agency from London. What that really means is we spend our time understanding people and in the context of what's going on in the wider world. And today I want to talk to you about a new generation, not the millennials that Arthur's just been talking about, but as Arthur suggested, a whole new generation that are coming along after millennials, and a generation that we believe are fundamentally different to millennials. We think it's got some really interesting implications for the arts and culture, which is, I guess, why we're here today. The work that we've done over the last 2 or 3 years, it's been primarily, at least initially, in the UK and the US and in Canada, but we're seeing a lot of consistency right the way across Western Europe with this world, with this work, and also a lot of the traits that we're going to talk about feel increasingly global as well. So if we're going to understand Generation Edge, we have to start by understanding the generational cohorts that have come before them. And in fact, we should probably start by understanding what the hell I'm talking about when I say generational cohorts. Generational cohort theory kind of dictates that our attitudes and our values and our beliefs are shaped by the things that took place when we were young, during our formative years, as the academics would say. This is the cultural context, economic context, political, technological, and so on. That stuff that takes place during our formative years makes us who we are. We carry that stuff with us through the rest of our lives. And that's important because it shapes the way that we engage with products and messages and ideas and indeed cultural experiences. So, starting over here on our left, with the baby boomers, they are obviously a very large generation by definition, born after the war. They're a generation who, while they were growing up, the world was in a great deal of turmoil. We had the Cold War, we had the construction of the Berlin Wall, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had the Vietnam War, assassination of Kennedy and Martin Luther King. But they were at the center of a huge amount of positive change. We had the student uprisings, we had the civil rights movement, we had female empowerment, we had sexual liberation taking place, we had the advent of pop music, we had the arrival of mass-produced electronic devices in the home. They put a man on the moon, for goodness sake. This is a generation that found themselves to be at the center of a huge amount of change and were very, very hopeful and remain a very hopeful and optimistic generation. They're the parents of the millennials, by the way. After those guys, Generation X came along. That's my lot. And when we were very young growing up, the world was in a great deal of turmoil. Economically, there was a lot of turmoil going on. It was a very dark place for us as young people because there was the ever-present threat of nuclear war. There was the AIDS epidemic, for example, but we also felt, by comparison to these baby boomers, smaller, less influential, less powerful. It gave rise to a generation that was kind of angry and rebellious and cynical. And that's important because they are the parents of the generation that we're about to talk about, Generation Edge. So hold that thought and remember that when we talk about Generation Edge. After Generation X, millennials came along. They're the guys that Arthur's just been talking to you about. Millennials, like the generations before them, they were born into a world of crisis. You know, we had wars and terrorism and big concerns over global warming and so on. But it was coupled by a huge amount of excitement and optimism. They were growing up in a time of ongoing economic growth. There was the digital revolution happening right in front of them. The internet was born, Google was born, Facebook was born, YouTube was born, all of this, iPhones were born, all of this stuff was happening while they were teenagers. It was an incredibly exciting time for them. And on top of that, they had these boomer parents, themselves full of hope and optimism, imbuing them with this really strong sort of sense of positivity. So they were a generation that's very idealistic. They believed they could kind of work together to make the world a better place. They're very hopeful, very optimistic, and famously very sure of their own ability and potential. And actually quite clear and conformist ideas of what it is to succeed in the world as well. Very clear sort of goals and benchmarks of success, and they're now having to slightly reevaluate some of that stuff in the recent economic downturn, which has been quite hard for them. But throughout all of this, they've been encouraged by their boomer parents to take time to grow up. Don't do it too quickly. Take time to establish who you are and to work out your identity. And so they've embraced stuff that allows them to demonstrate their maturity. Another big buzzword for millennials has been authenticity. Arthur touched on this a little bit as well. It's that opportunity in a world which can feel quite superficial at times because of social media. It's that opportunity to demonstrate to people, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is what I stand for. And of course, the technology thing, they remain to this day incredibly excited about technology. You can talk about technology, and millennials go, oh, technology, this is fantastic. It's very different with the next generation for reasons I'm going to explain. So the important point in all of this is for the last 10 or 12 years, youth culture, in inverted commas, has been millennials. Every time we talk about youth culture, we mean millennials. But millennials are growing up. They're getting older. The youngest millennial now is about 20 by our definition. The oldest one is 35. That means by the end of this decade, they're going to be 40. They're starting to kind of get married and get sensible jobs and go bald and all that sort of thing. They're not really that youthful anymore. So we need to start thinking about the next generation that's coming along. Generation Edge have been born into a very different world. And we've made a short film just to give you a little bit of a reminder of the world in which Generation Edge has been growing up.
President Obama, do solemnly swear and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Breaking news here. Stocks all around the world are tanking because of the price.
My name all over the place.
Michael Jackson is dead and has in fact died.
Company BP is challenging the government estimate of how much oil spilled into the Gulf.
Using these future bioprinters, hospitals could just print out a perfect organ whenever they needed one.
My name is Edward Snowden. I go by Ed.
The plane with 239 people on board vanished from radar.
The threat from this ISIS group reaching into the rest of the world.
Stop admitting West Africans into America right now.
Terror in the heart of Dallas.
Now, scenes of chaos are breaking out in Ferguson in the wake of the grand jury verdict.
So, let's try and summarize some of that stuff a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit, first of all, about the factors that have shaped this generation. Remember, we talk about cohort theory, the things that happen while you're growing up shape you, and you carry that stuff with you for the rest of your life. So it's important we understand the factors that are shaping this new generation. And the first one is the economic context. Let's think about this. The oldest person in this generation was 10 years old in 2005. Think about 2005. You're kind of staring into the economic abyss. If you compare that with millennials, the oldest millennial was 10 in 1990. They were looking ahead at 15 years of uninterrupted economic growth, so it was a very, very different context. But the other thing for Generation Edge, as well as all of this economic turmoil, it's also been a world which is full of turmoil and very short of hope and optimism, which in fact is why we call them Generation Edge, because they've been born into a world that feels as though it's on the edge of collapse at times, and they need a certain amount of edge or attitude in order to survive. They've been growing up very aware of the fact that there's a very intense competition for jobs. They've been looking ahead at their slightly older millennial cousins and seeing them emerging from university without the jobs that they thought they were going to get, or without the starting salaries that they thought they were going to get. They've been looking at their high levels of university debt, and they've been asking themselves, is it worth it? Is there a different way that I can get ahead? And if you look at the collapse of institutional trust, it's a really big difference when you compare them to millennials, because for millennials, the world was good. They trusted big brands and corporations who brought them that good life. But Generation Edge, think about what they've seen in their formative years. They've seen the banks getting bailed out only to give themselves big bonuses afterwards. They've seen big companies not paying all of their tax. They've seen the meat that they were eating turn out to be a horse. They've seen their parents working harder and harder for less and less return. They've seen local companies outsourcing jobs to Asia. They've seen a growing narrative around capitalism itself. Is it actually a good thing for us? And they're growing up questioning their relationship with big businesses and big organizations. They don't trust them. The default position is not to trust. They're being encouraged not to trust by their cynical Generation X parents. And they also have these subversive counterculture heroes like Ed Snowden and Julian Assange who are encouraging people to openly challenge everything they see and hear. So it's a very different context. Obviously there's technology, and there's three big things to say about technology. The first one is their closeness, their proximity to all of the stuff that you just saw in that film. They're not just watching that stuff, they're close to it, they're involved in it, they're engaged with it in ways that we never were. If you think about the refugee crisis in Europe at the moment, they're following these guys on Twitter, they're seeing the events unfold on Vine. If you think about the appalling terrorist atrocities being carried out in the Middle East, a huge proportion of teenagers have watched some of these absolutely appalling videos on YouTube. You think about the impact that has on them. If you think about, you saw some of the examples of the race riots in the US there recently. They've not just been watching that, they've been following the key participants on Twitter. They've been looking at live streaming of the demonstrations. They are very, very close to the action. The second thing to say about technology is that these guys have never known anything else. The oldest of them was 3 when Google launched. The oldest of them was 8 when the iPhone came along. They've never known anything else. Digital for them is not a thing. Digital just is. So we have to remember that. It's not exciting in the way that it is for millennials. The third thing about technology is that because they've grown up with technology all around them, they can see the risks of being over-connected, of being just looking at our screens all of the time. And they are determined not to live that way. They're determined that technology won't define them. Sometimes they want to get away, so we're going to talk about what that means as well. Finally, the parenting and schooling context is really interesting as well. We've moved from these boomer parents kind of helicoptering over people, as we call it, hovering above them and helping them at every stage and filling them with self-belief and optimism, this environment where everybody got a prize just for turning up. And that's changing because now we have Generation X parents, much more cynical, preparing them for a tough world. We sometimes joke that we've gone from a shift from boomer parents saying, world, get ready for my kid, to Generation X parents saying, kid, you better get ready for the world. And in the schooling context, teachers say to us, if these kids have got all the information in the world, then we don't need teachers to give them information. We need teachers to encourage them to develop critical reasoning skills, to build strong arguments, and they're certainly doing that. So how does this stuff manifest itself? Well, the first thing we see is that they have a very different idea of what it is to succeed. They have slightly less lofty goals than millennials. You won't hear these guys saying that they're going to be the startup of a social media company by the age of 22 or whatever. They're much more pragmatic, they're much more realistic, and they're much less about those kind of conformist measures of success that millennials had. It's less about the salary, it's less about the promotions. It's more about working out what makes them happy, working out what they're good at, and we're finding from a very young age they're choosing very specific jobs and mapping out all the things they're going to need to do to get those jobs. And we see a generation that is really, really determined and driven, a generation that really will look out for themselves first and foremost. Whenever we talked about millennials, this very collaborative generation, we used to use images of Harry Potter, all these kids kind of working together to advance good over evil. Whereas when we talk about Generation Edge, we use images of the Hunger Games, not because we're saying they're literally going to kill one another, of course, but because they're very, very determined to look out for themselves first and foremost. They're incredibly hardworking. And they're also very, very resourceful because they know that they're able to find the information and the tools that they need in order to get ahead. The trouble is that they are having, what the expression we use in the UK is, they have old heads on young shoulders. They have this very accelerated adulthood. So unlike millennials who had the luxury of a fairly extended period of youth, these guys have had to grow up very fast. And as we discussed, they've seen a lot through the unfiltered internet as they've grown up. You think about the effect that has on them, but also think about the relationships that they're forming. Relationships are really accelerated now because everything's put out there on social media. They've all sent a picture of their dick to everybody on Snapchat. They're growing up watching pornography in some cases from a very young age. It affects the nature of their relationships. There's a certain lost innocence to all of this. They feel under a huge amount of pressure to get the grades, to get the jobs. And one of the things that's really noticeable with this generation is a big decline in hedonistic behavior. They're not drinking as much, they're not doing as many drugs, they've changed. Young people aren't what young people used to be. But coupled with that, there's a really big increase in mental health issues. Arthur touched on some of this stuff a little bit with millennials and the stress and the pressure that they face. These guys, it's much more pronounced. There are some really big problems here. Another big difference compared to millennials is millennials weren't a very rebellious generation. They didn't have a great deal to rebel against, really, whereas this generation is driven by a need to change things. They feel this really strong concern at everything that they think is broken and unfair, and that could be politics, law, business, opportunities for the young, the property market, the environment. They feel really driven about all of this stuff. And millennials always said they were going to change the world, but these guys feel a real frustration that millennials didn't actually do very much about it. And these guys believe that they've got the determination and the anger and certainly the means to make a difference, to really challenge things. And there's lots of examples of Generation Edge from a very young age challenging businesses and laws and governments and forcing change in a way that is quite impressive, I have to say. They're very socially engaged as a generation, often on a much more local level or an issue-based level. They're not necessarily engaging very much with mainstream politics unless there's a very specific issue that they care about. So if we think about what's been happening over the water in Scotland, for example, the Scottish referendum, the performance of the Scottish National Party, they're driven to a large degree by young people. The election of Jeremy Corbyn as our new opposition leader in the UK, a very, very leftist politician, driven with a really large mandate from young voters in the UK. And I understand that young voters have also had quite a big impact in your recent municipal elections over here as well, where there is particular issues that they care very strongly about. So they will get involved when there are issues that they care strongly about. It's a generation that embraces the alternative. You know, anything that challenges the status quo, they're likely to engage with. Millennials actually had quite a conformist idea of how to be, whereas these guys, they really value the individual. For them, being different is pretty much the coolest thing that you can be. So what does it all mean? That's the big question. And I guess the simple answer is we don't know. Our agency, we don't profess to be experts on the arts. That's you guys. You are the experts on the arts, so you can help us understand what this stuff means. The other thing is it's a story which is still being written. The oldest of them is only about to turn 20s. There's a whole load of them still to come along. But despite all of that, we do have a few thoughts on what we think are the potential implications for all of you, but it would be great to discuss it and get your perspectives as well. The first one is we think that they'll engage more and more with art that has a strong message behind it, or alternatively, art that captures the way that they feel. They feel reformist, they feel reactionary, they feel edgy, but they also feel a lot of pressure and a lot of pain. So there's a potential artistic outlet in all of that. Recently, by the way, we asked a lot of 15 and 16-year-olds in different countries around, different cities around the world to take cameras and to use photography to demonstrate to us how it felt to be part of that generation. And we exhibited that work in galleries in various cities around the world. These are some examples of the kind of images that we got back, and in each case they explained to us what the image was trying to convey. And we were really struck by the extent to which these images were describing emotions around pressure, mental health issues, also determination, frustration at perceptions of young people as lazy. There was some really strong themes coming through in all of this, and just by looking at these images you can get a little bit of a sense of how that felt to them. So one school of thought is we should embrace this stuff. We should have art which holds up a mirror to them and reflects this. The other school of thought is that, in fact, as Arthur was suggesting, they will want art as an opportunity to escape. So maybe they'll value art which is fun and whimsical and romantic and kind of a counter to all of that grim reality that they've grown up with. One of the things that's been fascinating us is the success of the Bronies movement. Has anybody seen the Bronies movement? So this is basically teenagers and in some cases full-grown adults as well coming together around a love of My Little Pony. And they're filling out conferences and conventions far bigger than this place today. It's absolutely extraordinary. And the image that we have here is one of Candy Ravers. I don't know if anybody's come across these guys, but it's a growing movement, quite a young movement, celebrating peace and love and unity and respect. And here they are. One of their big things is about these bracelets that they wear around their wrists. One of their big things is about trading these candy bracelets when you have a good experience with somebody. It's a community with some very precise rules, one of which is the strict intolerance of drugs. They don't have drugs at all, which personally I find extraordinary to see them dressed up in this way. And no drugs, doesn't make sense. But anyway, this is Candy Ravers taking over Disneyland. Apparently this happens once a year. Tens of thousands of them descend on Disneyland, and we're seeing this starting to grow up in more and more places across Europe as well now. Something is going on here, and we think it's about escapism. The next idea is that Generation Edge as a reformist generation will really value an alternative to what they have seen going before. This is a generation that's starting to reject these big corporate music festivals. You know, they look at Glastonbury, which is full up of, increasingly sort of well-off 30 and 40-year-olds, and they're rejecting that, and they're starting to favor much kind of smaller, more unplugged, more lo-fi gatherings. Like, for example, So Far Sounds. Has anybody heard about So Far Sounds? So it's a really interesting network for private concerts where people come together and artists put on gigs, often in people's living rooms, very small scale. In London, we're seeing something like 3,000 applicants for every gig at the moment, and you can only have about 50 people turn up. And I understand that So Far Sounds made its debut in Norway last month with its inaugural gig in Oslo, so watch out for that. I think it's going to get bigger and bigger. If we think about art, We're seeing a lot of evidence that Generation Edge wants to get involved, but in new ways, on their terms, making art accessible in a way that feels really reformist. We have some involvement with a not-for-profit organization in Chicago called I Paint My Mind, and they borrow art and they display it in temporary exhibitions around the city in ways that hopefully feel very accessible to people who maybe wouldn't typically go to a gallery. And they also work in collaboration with a number of young and up-and-coming artists to make their work available at low price points where kids can basically print it at home for themselves. So it's all about making art more accessible to people who perhaps wouldn't normally get involved. And an interesting, another Chicago example, we have an office there, hence all the Chicago examples. Pitchfork Music Festival, they have a lot of different stalls, as well as the music at the festival. And one of those stalls at Pitchfork gives people the opportunity to screen print their own art. They get involved in the screen printing process. And this stall had far and away the biggest queues of all the stalls at the festival for the last couple of years. Now the big brands are starting to get involved. So you can see here Top Man has rolled up, offering people the opportunity to screen print their own t-shirts at the festival. I think what this means is, of course, it's an example of art becoming more accessible, but it's also an example of art as a tangible experience because they're getting involved in the printing and the production. So speaking of tangible experiences, this is something that obviously Arthur touched on quite a lot, and it's certainly coming through very strongly in our work as well. Because Generation Edge have grown up in this world. It looks a little bit like this. I'm sure you're all much better parents than this, obviously, but they see a lot of this, and they worry about it. They're starting to question the damage that this over-connection is doing to them, and they're saying, we're going to take time to actively connect with real people, to connect with our experience, to connect with our emotions, rather, to actually, feel real things. There's an increasing need for tangible experiences, from nature to food to connecting with their sensations. And so we're seeing increasing evidence of the parents themselves encouraging their Gen Edge kids to do this. There's been a big growth in the UK of something called Root Camp, where kids go away for summer camp and learn how to grow and cook their own food. We're seeing in the US and in the UK a big growth in that very Scandinavian phenomenon, which is forest schools, just getting kids to be outside and connect with nature. It's increasingly important for them. So I suppose the question is, is there an opportunity here? And surely there is for the arts to capitalize on this more. Arthur touched on this a little bit, but our view is maybe we shouldn't be asking why don't young people come to experience the fine arts, or how can we make it more contemporary. Maybe we should be asking, what's the point of attending a gallery or a concert? What are the emotions that they want to feel? And then can we put these emotions at the center of the experience? Now, if you look at a parallel industry, you look at the music industry, for example, I think it's absolutely been reframed in that way. We've seen huge growth in mood-based curation, in Spotify and SoundCloud, where people are creating playlists, collections of music for every conceivable mood or occasion. And I think we're going to see much, much more of that sort of stuff being designed to elicit a particular emotion. A lot of projections suggest that Generation Edge are going to be living at home with their parents for a very, very long time. So commiserations for those of you in the audience who have teenagers at the moment. I don't know what it's like in Oslo and in Kristiansand, but in London, apparently, they're going to be 35 before they move out of home, which is pretty terrifying. It's an appalling prospect. But one of the interesting things about it is there's actually quite an interesting alignment of values going on here. Generation X parents living with these Generation Edge kids who share a lot of the same beliefs and a lot of the same values, and we're seeing some quite interesting cultural consequences of that. One of the things I have to do as a day job is we go and do workshops with big companies like Unilever, because frankly, that's what pays the bills, right? And we did a workshop with Unilever recently in which we brought a lot of 14 and 15-year-old kids along to talk to them. And we asked them, bring us the music that you think that brands should play if they're going to really engage with you. And we were expecting to hear all this kind of, crazy new stuff that we didn't recognize. And instead we heard the Clash and the Stranglers and the Sex Pistols. They were getting it, of course, from their parents, but we're seeing a bit of a kind of a trade-off, but a bit of a rub-off between parents and kids. They're sharing cultural ideas in a really interesting way. One of the partners at our agency is a drummer in a punk band, and he tells us that 5 or 10 years ago, every gig they did, it was full up with people at least my age, if not older. Whereas now, those guys still come along, but they're bringing their teenage kids with them as well. We're seeing a huge resurgence in punk music, not least because it's an outlet for the kind of the angst and the reformism and so on that they feel. So there's definitely some sort of interesting cultural alliance going on between these two generations, and maybe this alliance could even be powerful enough to outweigh the influence of millennials quite soon. Another question, does it give us a new type of artist? We know that Generation Edge has a very different relationship with media. If we think about the way that they consume YouTube, they like YouTube because it gives them an opportunity to feel very close to certain artists and creatives. And they've seen certain YouTubers grow really, really massive, really big, but they continue to feel really unpolished and very, very real, which is really important. These guys, does anyone know who these guys are? I didn't. They're called Our Second Life. They're part pop stars and part vloggers. They're all aged between 15 and 17. Most of them have been on YouTube since they were 10 or 11. They've got 2.5 million subscribers to their YouTube channel, and they mostly sit in their bedrooms talking about their feelings. They talk about They talk about their fans as their friends, not their followers. But the amazing thing is they've just sold out a 15-city concert tour in the US in big stadiums as well. Apparently they do music too. And I think the point here is that for new artists, increasingly, it's about much more than just the creative end product. It's about sharing something with people as well, perhaps about who you are and what your motivations are and so on. And while we're talking about YouTube, obviously we've seen a really big shift with this generation in the way that media is consumed. Television feels like a very linear medium, whereas YouTube feels like a very two-way medium. They feel engaged with the content that they're consuming. So clearly it's possible to really engage this audience. The problem is that their default position is not to trust big businesses and big organizations. We have to earn their trust. We have to, I think, have something of real value to share with them. So the solution isn't just more social media by default. It can't be that. It has to involve perhaps a more direct involvement with the artists. Easy when the artists are alive, a little bit harder when the artists are dead, obviously. But I think above all, the message here is think about the benefit. If we're doing digital stuff, think about the benefit. What's in it for them? Digital in itself isn't the benefit. They're not excited by digital or by new technology. And so rather flippantly, we sometimes say digital is dead altogether. Okay, it's not, but digital as a separate entity for these guys is dead, as something that's different to other channels. That doesn't make any sense to them. They don't use the word digital. This generation has never known any different after all, so don't think of digital as separate. It's about having a consistent presence, a consistent narrative, a consistent experience, however and wherever you happen to encounter them. I worked for quite a long time for the BBC, and it's what we used to call at the BBC 360-degree commissioning. The idea being that digital is not just an add-on to what you do, but it's actually an integral part of the product. So digital isn't dead. I think the final point I wanted to leave you with is that they're increasingly using digital as a really interesting discovery tool. So we see young people finding and connecting with, let's say, a graffiti artist in Taiwan, or a composer in rural Canada, or a steampunk aficionado in Latvia. That's what they're doing. They're finding them and they're connecting with them. They're so proficient at building their own individuality in this way, and tools like Pinterest and Instagram and YouTube are making this much, much easier for them. So in summary, we think a very different generation is coming. In many ways, everything has changed. Everything you've heard before about millennials has changed. But if you can embrace that, then we think this is a generation that's got really big amounts of potential and possibility. So thank you and good luck.
God morgen. Good morning. I'm a professor, but I'm going to try not to talk like one. But you have to put up with me for a little bit. We're talking in this session for a good chunk of time about generation. And it's a tricky word because it's a case that disturbs the professor in that you use the same word for different phenomena or different concepts. So when we say grandpa and his generation, which people always say, often say, what do we mean? Because it could mean at least three things. It could mean grandpa and other people his age. In that case, we mean age group or age category. And then the people who are the same age as you become your peers, right? Many times we have found in many countries that people equate peer with friend and friend with peer. And it's highly unlikely that you say, he's my close friend, and he is very different from you in age. He's typically roughly the same age as you. So that's one. A second one is what demographers and sociologists often would call cohort. And what we then point to is, when did you enter history? The flow of history, given your age. And when I used to teach master's students and PhD candidates, I always had that as a real strong goal, that when you have listened to me for a semester, from here on, when you hear a person's age, I want you to automatically say, okay, so that means she was born in, and she was 16 in such and such a time. She became 20 in such and such a year. What was Norway like when they had certain birthdays? And that's one that most of you in your work really need to pay attention to, because the age indicates the cultural, historical landscape that the lifetime of people has traveled through, where your life's løype has gone. Often we call those historical generations. But the problem with that, I would be ready to bet that some of you have siblings who are very close to you in age, but where you feel that you're part of very different cohorts and historical generations. Am I right? I think many of us women feel that men our age are from a different, like Middle Ages, even though they are roughly our age. Now, what does that have to do with? It has to do with what we often call milestones or watersheds. vannskiller in our society that really creates a different breed of cat. Now, some people who are interested in historical generations argue that it's what happens to you early in life that will shape you for the rest of your life. So the timing of a watershed or the timing of a big historical event makes a difference for how it shapes you. I used to teach that, and I'm not so sure anymore. I taught in Germany the first year after Berlin Wall fell. I had in my PhD class a woman who would cry every single lecture because her adult life had been changed completely. She was not a child, she was not a teenager when the wall fell. But she lost her PhD because it was from East Germany and Leningrad. Colleagues of mine in Germany lost their title as professors overnight. And it was too late in their lives to start over again. So I think the most important thing is to be very much aware of the interaction between your biographical time and life history and events in history. And I think if you think of watersheds, the United States, where your first speaker is based, talks about 9/11 as a total watershed, right? And we're beginning to see that maybe people who were young at that time have more burn marks. But I'm not sure that we can draw that conclusion yet. That was in 2001, right? And 10 years later, we had our Utøya. I don't think we have observed long enough the interplay of age and history to draw any conclusions about whose lives were the most profoundly and deeply affected. But we certainly need to keep that in mind when we start thinking about historical generations and watersheds. And then, of course, the third concept of generation, which we use the same word for, is being a grandfather. Position in a family lineage. And it's really important to keep in mind that even grandfathers, but even more so grandmothers, can be totally different ages. I sometimes use Kurt Nielsen, the artist, as an example. He became a grandfather at 33. But one point I want us to really start thinking about, and I think it's really, really important. I've done a lot of work on grandparenthood in Norway and the United States. And there is a lot of history bridging going on in family generations. And it's not only grandpa talking about the war. Pretty soon we won't have any more grandfathers that can talk about the war because they're gone. But I have been really struck by how grandparents and grandchildren are mutually teaching each other. And it's nice that in Norwegian we don't distinguish between learning and teaching. And I'll tell you a secret. A lot of what goes on between grandparents and grandchildren, the parents in the middle have no idea about. So when you, and I have done this, when I asked Norwegian parents who had 10 to 12-year-old children about what their parents had taught the child, they talked on and on and on. And it was everything from the war to fishing and baking and making jam and you name it. And then I said, so what do you think your child has taught your mother or father? And many of the parents said, I don't think really, I can't think of anything. And when we asked the kids, have you taught your grandparent anything? They looked at you as if they were totally stupid, and they said, of course. And I think you can guess what the most common examples of such teaching was. It had to do with internet and cell phones, mobile phones, sending SMSs. And one boy I interviewed myself said, yeah, farmor, I have tried to teach her SMS, but I must tell you, it has been hard. I think that it's important when we listen to people, specialists such as Arthur and Stuart this morning, to keep in mind, to start your brain going on these three concepts. And then there is one that's totally missing. And I don't think it's accidental that this happened, because there were two men speaking. They did not mention gender, did they? No. But I think everybody, when you start thinking about it, especially if you're a woman, you will know that you can't talk about generation in any of the three senses without thinking about gender. And sometimes the big watersheds are much more for one gender than the other. For example, there is a watershed in Norway by when you were born in terms of education. Do you know when you must have been born to be in a cohort, a historical generation where women have more highly educated people than men do? When did that trend start? It started in the 70s, so when were you born? What cohort would you be in? Mid-1950s, because that would make you 20 at 75, right? 1975. See how I want you to think? Yeah. I would definitely say that in those cohorts of women, you have a different breed of cat. And they are going to, and we're beginning to see it, they're going to be very different old women. Much harder to deal with, and much less nice. Now, your challenge, I think, in trying to market culture and cultural events is to have all those three in mind. And I think it's interesting that the two previous speakers talked a lot about how this has to do with sociability, including food. And part of that sociability is contact across family generations. I think more and more grandparents take children, grandchildren to cultural events. They take them on trips to see ruins and famous historical places and museums in different parts of the world. I've done it myself. I've met many grandparents and many grandchildren. And you have to find new ways of maximizing, I think, that effect of people wanting to be together when they enjoy cultural events. And never forget grandparents, because right now we have lots of them. I know, because a journalist calls me about once a week, and I have now started to say, by any chance, did you just become a grandparent? Well, we have baby boomers as grandparents now, right? The biggest birth cohort ever in Norway is the 1946 cohort. I bet you knew that. But the baby boom in Norway continued longer than in most other countries. We are also a long-lived society, but don't forget, when you look at people over 80, you have almost twice as many women as men. Don't forget it. And if you look at Kulturbarometeret, data from Statistics Norway on use of culture, guess what? Women across events, from concerts to theater to museums to reading books. Reading books is much more stable than we are often led to believe. But across the board, independently somewhat of age and cohort, women engage in cultural activities more than men, with one exception. Sports. So you have a challenge here. You know, could you have poetry festivals hooked up with soccer tournaments? And barbecue meals in the park? Where you invited 3-4 generations? And let the men get their soccer? It's a challenge. It's a challenge. And I wanted to present it to you. I have done a fair amount of my work in the United States, but also doing consulting and speaking for the United Nations. The United Nations has a program called Gender and Generation. Important. And they have a survey going on where Norway is a participant called the Gender and Generation Survey. But my message to you is, always think gender when you think generation. When you think generation, think at least 3 phenomena. Thank you so much.
Da har det vært mye om generasjoner her. Mye fra utlandet, og litt problematisering hjemmefra. Og nå er det rett og slett sånn at det blir en liten samtale, og den inviteres dere inn i. Og jeg håper jo at for dere sitter jo på et vis med de norske erfaringene, og kan utfordre særlig det amerikanske og det engelske i forhold til om det stemmer. Det vil bli lagt ut mikrofoner. De skal komme på hver side, og da må dere rett og slett gå og stille dere opp, og så holder jeg et øye om det kommer noen som har lyst til å si noe. Men dette er altså en anledning, så jeg håper dere gjør det. Well, Arthur and Stuart, I have to start with this kick Gunhild gave to you on not putting gender on the generational agenda. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's not got a lot to do with me being a man. It's got a little bit, it's got a little bit more to do with two big characteristics of this generation. One of them being that diversity and equality seem to be the norm for them. Whether that's correct or not, I don't know, but that's the perception that much more that they're seeing that as part of their environment. But also, gender fluidity is more and more commonplace among young people now. So we're seeing, for example, much greater representation of transgenderism, for example, in popular culture for them, but also a much more personal fluidity of gender as well. A new survey was out in the UK last month, which suggested that half of all teenagers consider themselves to be not entirely heterosexual. Remarkably, so I think that gender is much more complicated for them now than a simple male versus female thing. But equally, I think that they don't perceive there to be that kind of imbalance in opportunity for men and women that would have been characterized by older generations.
And I think what we're seeing is that gender is, on the other end of the age spectrum, playing a decreasing role in terms of differentiation. And that's for social and economic factors, at least in the States. The reason that the typical cultural consumer used to be a 56-year-old woman who was making all the decisions about buying tickets, and if she was a grandmother, I agree, she was bringing her kids and all that stuff, is because in a previous generation that woman didn't work, and she had a lot more kind of time and effort to focus on kind of organizing those family things. We now have an entire generation of grandparents and elderly who both had careers, and I think there's a lot more fluidity on all ends in terms of taking the responsibility to organize family events, to make initiatives towards, say, grandchildren, to include them in culture or to teach them about culture as well. And I would also say, I hadn't really thought about this until I heard of Gunhild's research. It might be a cultural point of difference between, Norwegian society and American society, but the phenomenon of the grandparent being the facilitator for culture to a grandchild, I think is relatively the exception in the US. I think that there is not a lot of fluidity multi-generationally for that activity, and you can disagree if you want. I also think that the activity of going with a grandparent is not necessarily one that is consistent with the kind of social mores of the grandchild's peer group either. And here, it's possible that there's different levels of comfort intergenerationally with those kind of moments. But again, this is your research, and I'm just speculating what might be a difference because we don't see it the way that you do.
Okay, now there's one microphone here and one there, so you just feel free. Arthur, I think you said you had an interesting statement in your presentation about the social coming first, and then everything else follows.
Right.
And that millenniums always travel in pairs.
Yes, both those things we think are true. And by social coming first, I just want to frame everything as that the cultural visit has a social agenda as its primary agenda. That is not to say, I think sometimes this stuff gets dismissed, and I've had heated conversations with curators and music directors. It's like, no, it's the art. We are not denigrating the art, and all of us are in this room because we are committed, I think, to the unique power of the cultural moment. But all we're saying is there's a lot of things that have to happen between walking in the door and getting someone in front of whatever that moment might be, whether it's a painting or a play or an opera, that have to do with a kind of social adaptation and acknowledging that people have a lot of emotion coming into it, and that they have to first know that they are welcome and comfortable and can then open up to the experience that you're going to present to them. I think historically the cultural world has been a top-down world in which we had the expectation that the audience rises up to the level of the cultural presenter, and there was a lot of intimidation. One of the things that we encounter a lot is that, I think what people feel is they don't know how to do opera. They have no training in it, they have no background. How do I do it? Why would I spend all that money to make myself feel stupid? So to understand that there are things that the cultural organizations need to do to, again, get people to neutral and to create a welcoming environment, understanding that those primary things are emotional and social before they have the opportunity to be cultural.
I know that you, Gunhild, has an interesting reflection on that, on how grandparents if we should use the generational, the baby boomers and the millenniums, has a possibility to open up when they go together to places that in pre-wars even don't necessarily see the opera, for instance, as their place to attend, but along with their millennium grandchildren, it opens up to a new freedom.
Every time I go to the Munch Museum in Oslo, the generation researcher in me feels wonderful because it is so cross-generational. It's very young children and very old people, and typically they are families or godparents and so forth, going with children they have a special relationship with. But it's totally intergenerational. And it's fun to see. And there is food.
Good food?
Yeah.
And Stuart, you said, don't necessarily ask why don't people attend, but ask why should they attend?
Yeah, so I mean, fairly consistently with some of what Arthur was discussing as well, I think we should focus a little bit more on the emotions that people hope to experience when attending cultural experiences. So we design less for the pigeonholed kind of definition of culture per se. Instead, we think about what are people going to get out of it in a world where they're unbelievably connected all of the time, they're looking at screens all of the time, they're buried in virtual worlds all of the time. We're seeing this need to get away from all of that and feel real things, to just touch things and smell things and taste things and connect with their emotions. So it feels like a really big opportunity for the arts, that if we can start to center our story or our proposition around those emotions that people hope to experience, we can do something really successful. And I was using the example a little bit of Spotify. Spotify has employed loads and loads of people, human beings, to work alongside the algorithms to create playlists that play to a particular mood, whether that mood is just happy or whether that mood is I'm sitting in Starbucks having a flat white at this point in time. There is a playlist for it. And I think more and more we can design for those experiences that people want to feel. And I think that could be cross-generational as well.
Totally. Yeah.
Jeg må bare si, hvis det noen som har lyst til å spørre om et eller annet og ikke har så lyst til å prate engelsk, så det helt mulig, for jeg bare oversetter. Så det ikke noe problem. It was just an opportunity to speak Norwegian if anyone wanted to ask you anything. This expression, old head on young shoulders, is a strong one.
We've been very struck by it. I think when you look at the circumstances in which this generation have grown up, it would be easy to think that they were feeling very defeatist and very almost broken by what's gone on around them, but instead they're incredibly determined, and we're really impressed by them as a generation, the level of determination and maturity that they have. But you can't help but notice that they seem to have more opinions than people had when I was young. They have seen and experienced far more stuff than people had ever done previously. And they haven't, because of the economic context, they haven't had that opportunity to spend time working out who they are and having an extended adolescence in the way millennials did. They've had to get straight out there and work out what they're going to do in life. We sometimes see that happening from as early as 11 or 12, you know, having a clear idea about what job they're going to do and all the things they must achieve in order to get there. And if you put that into the context of all the stuff they've seen on the internet, it's quite remarkable how mature they are. In many ways, that's a really positive thing, but also, you know, you have to have an escape from that sometimes. We've got to allow them to be kids. We've got to allow them to be teenagers sometimes. And I think there are huge opportunities there for the arts.
Gunnel, you wanted to comment
yeah,
on that?
I would like to have a longer debate with you, but we've touched on it because not long ago in the Norwegian press there was a lot of attention and media to young girls carrying handbags worth 15,000 kroner for their school stuff.
Yeah.
And there is also that to me, as a person that lived through the 60s in a very nearly closely, feel is a superficiality and a materialism. You have to have perfect eyebrows and a perfect purse.
Yeah.
And I think one thing I'm missing from your presentation, but I think you agree with me, is that you see a higher diversity of either you're in there and serious and thinking and engaged and goal-directed, or you've sort of given up.
Yeah.
And just want to be comfortable.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, we talked a little bit about this before. There is a growing kind of polarization,
yes,
or disparity between opportunity in society. And you know, sadly, my job is to look for commercial opportunities for big brands, and so we tend to focus on the things which represent opportunity. There's no doubt that there is a proportion of this demographic that as you say, has retreated into their own homes and is feeling very, very miserable and is experiencing a lot of mental health issues as well. So yeah, there's a growing problem there. I would certainly agree with that.
And I think internationally, recently, we've had a discussion of growing inequality among young people, that the haves and have-nots are becoming more and more different. And grandparents are actually part of that package. that not having available and resourceful grandparents makes you more disadvantaged.
Okay, then we have someone from the audience. First here.
Hello, I'm Hanne Beate Ueland from Stavanger Art Museum, and I found a lot of what's been discussed here really interesting on many levels. But I wanted to go back to something that you talked about, Arthur. You talked about multisensory experiences, and that in the future you would like to see more of sort of art and science and different, and also it has been touched upon by others. And I was wondering, because in Norway we've had, for the recent years in the museum sector, we've had this consolidation process of different museums being organized together, and then you have museums involving arts and natural history and different kinds of subjects. And on the other hand, working in an art museum, you see these international brands of art museums like the Guggenheim and like these big brands that are expanding throughout the world. And so it's really interesting. In my museum we have a sort of natural history department, and we can work with them and we can do collaborative projects, and we try to do that as much as possible. But I was wondering if you had an example or a sort of, you say you're talking about the future, but do you know of any good examples of these multisensory experiences?
Sure. I would also suggest that those examples you cited are two very different things. I think if you're dealing with the combination of existing museums that are somehow folded into one, you deal with what we call legacy issues. You know, each of them has a unique culture that they are bringing to the table, different ways of doing things, and I imagine the process isn't always easy, right? Different sets of values, different even definitions of success. I guess what I'm talking about as a future model is one in which an individual organization is looking to activate its experiences across all different senses. So one thing, the most surprisingly successful exhibition we worked on, which just closed last week at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was a costume institute show, a fashion institute show called China Through the Looking Glass.
Yeah.
Did anyone in this room see that?
Yeah.
Anybody? All right, well, so let's just say for a costume institute show in New York at that museum, we typically would see about, if it's a really good show, it'll be anywhere between 285 and 450,000 people. We saw 850,000 people. It was one of the top 10 shows of any kind ever presented at this museum. And I think that's because it did a number of things. One is that it took on a specific art form as a window into the world. And I think a lot of the things that you're hearing from my colleagues here have to do with the notion of the art experience helping you make sense of the world around you. And China is a very, very interesting and hot topic. The actual experience of that wasn't just dresses on mannequins. When you walked in, there was film, there was sound, there was even, on a limited level, and I think I'd be curious to see if they try it more, there was a room where you had a scent that was commissioned for this experience that was meant to, it harkened back to the mystique of the Orient in the 1980s when Yves Saint Laurent created opium. And it was about that moment. And so what people took from this was complete sensory and sensual immersion. And it elevated an experience that otherwise and historically has been limited to objects presented on mannequins as fixed and kind of observational things into something that left a trace, you know? And I think that's what happens. I mean, there's a lot of science behind which senses actually go deepest into the memory, and I believe that scent is the one that is supposed to evoke memory quickest and most fully. Yeah. So the idea of experiences that can be extended this way, and on a more rudimentary or fundamental level, the idea of tying in food that relates to the experience of the exhibition, it's just, first of all, it makes it a little more human and a little less just didactic in a way, and it complements the rigor of the exhibition with something that has a kind of sensory reward. I would just say that, you know, considering what you do with different kind of museums working together, the really interesting opportunity is to think of what if one could create a museum from scratch right now that would do all those things, but do it with a unified set of values and a unified organizational vision right from the beginning. Because I just think people are people, and it's very, very hard when places are forced together to create a culture where everyone feels like they are together because they're not being given the same level of attention they were when they were autonomous. So there's a lot of, I think, other factors that play into it.
Then we also have a question over here.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Kristin Raknes. I'm from the Norwegian National Contemporary Dance Company, and I'm a communication director there. We tour around Norway, and we tour a little bit around in the world. But it's only me and my colleague here doing the marketing. So when it's a little bit the same question, but I'll change it around. Because when you say multi-sensory, you know, my marketing brain says, oh, it's everything for everybody. And then I start to wonder, what about all this segmentation that we want to do? And the voice that we want to, you know, what about the uniqueness of dance, which is what I do? Do I have to bring in a cook? You know, like, and I'm putting this onto the edge now because, you know, you told some things and then you come and say something else, which is fantastic. And just a comment to Stuart, my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter is stealing my Nirvana t-shirt, so, you know, spot on.
Yeah.
And she's got perfect eyebrows as well. But I'm wondering, so if we don't, can we not, seriously go into the dance for my sake, Do we need to put the dance in the park with the picnic, with soccer playing in the background, or is it anything we can do for these people to say that, you have to experience dance and you have to sit down, stress down, and just watch it?
Sure. I'm happy to answer that because we work with a couple dance organizations, and obviously this is not to say every experience you offer has to do all these things or it will fail. Although to me, the idea of going into a park at night and having a really nice sandwich and watching a great dance sounds pretty good, I would just add. But beyond that, the issue with dance, here's the, you know what happens in dance research? And you ask people who don't go to dance why they don't get, do you know one of the things they say? I don't understand, do I look at their face or do I look at their feet? Guess what? That is a really good question, right? So just to be, again, empathic with the audience and say, I would say as a mild multisensory experience to either before or after the dance performance, either have the choreographer or the dancers talk about their preparation, talk about the emotional training, talk about what they feel and who they're thinking of and how they approach it, to use another level of connection that's more emotionally accessible to give people a pathway in, right? To decode. In that sense, I would just say the multisensory opportunity is greatest in demystifying. It's the same thing we often say when we're working with orchestras. Like you want to yell at the conductor, turn around, we're here. I don't want to see your back the entire performance. I want to know what you feel. Why did you choose this piece of music? What should I look for? Or afterwards, maybe you turn around and ask me what I thought, and we have a talk back about it, right? And maybe we do it over drinks and make it even more multisensory, right? That kind of experience that makes a logical connection to the specificity of the art form. But again, I still would like to see dance at night in a park. I think that sounds great.
And by the way, just building on some of what Arthur said there, I mean, you talked about finding a way in, a pathway in, which I think is really important. We're also seeing with millennials that it's so important to give them something to take out as well. That's to say that for millennials, Arthur touched on the idea of culture being consumed as a social experience. We find with millennials that such a big part of their consumption of cultural events is to do with having stories that can contribute to their own sense of identity. So why do people go to secret cinema instead of just going to watch a film? Why do people go to experiential food events instead of just going to the restaurant? It's partly because they want to come away with stories that they can tell that can help people to understand even better who they are and what authentic people they are. So giving them all the kind of the tools that they can have to construct those stories, I think is incredibly important.
If I were to contextualize you in some audience development terms, I would say that you are arguing strongly for in-streaming, that is from the people towards the art or the culture, and also for the post-streaming, that is from the art and afterwards. But the mid-streaming, which is when it interferes with the artistic or cultural production, there you are seem more reluctant.
Well, you should be. I think that's where you have to be most thoughtful and respectful of the art, because all of us, again, we're here in this room because we believe that there is something uniquely powerful about the artistic moment, and we don't want to do anything that takes away from it. But what we do leading up to and after are great opportunity areas. I actually believe the future is all going to be about after. Especially through what we do through social media in terms of forming community out of experiences that have been shared that then people want to share those stories that Stuart's talking about. What happens at that particular moment, I guess I would say I even believe that's sacred, But I think there's so much that can be done both to cue it up and then to extend it. And there's so little imagination that's been put into the stretching of the experience on both ends.
If I see we are getting close to lunch, and I really have to ask one more question, because you said, Arthur, that frequency is down, and this is what worries the most institutions. Yeah. And you said that even people cry when they see your slide
they do.
on how bad
they hate
it declines. But you also talked about it's no need in fixing old loyalty models. It's about creating new ones. And then you also said that you don't really go to the cultural sector to find those new models. Do you go to other sectors?
Right.
Can you give some takeaways to the audience on
Right.
where you're going and where
Let
they
me
should be?
get to that. Just two parts. Frequency is down, but we have, and I'm curious what you guys do, we have clients now who count online visitors as visitors. They categorize them as such, but that's audience for them. So traditionally defined physical participation frequency is down, but frequency that includes new models of participation and new avenues into experience is up, okay? We've been asking a traditional question, and I think it's our own fault, because when we do this next, we're probably going to divide it up and talk about the physical versus the virtual, because they're both forms of participation, obviously, that have different conditions around them. In terms of the future loyalty models, you know, for example, the theater subscription model was created, I think, in the United States in 1971 to make money. It was totally for the benefit of the presenter. The bullshit story that was told is that it's going to make your life easier for planning, but it was an economic device to capture more audience and lock them in. Today's audience has no interest in that, and they can choose and pick and choose easily by themselves. So what are they interested in? Well, they're interested in incentives, and they're interested in community. And what is remarkable to me about the cultural world, particularly those who have done really a good job at building a big group of members or subscribers, is we never, think about this, we never connect them to each other, right? That's true. Wow. There are no, for example, chat rooms of members and subscribers afterwards for most performance events hosted by the presenter that enables you to connect with someone you don't know, but who's already in a self-defined shared community of membership, and have engagement with them. Everything is mediated through the presenter. And that's ridiculous. That's not how people want to live anymore. So the models that we're looking at are models that do two things, that provide incentives and rewards that are valued by the audience, and also create opportunities for direct member-to-member, subscriber-to-subscriber engagement. That's where we think it's going.
And is Generation Edge in the same line? Do you agree? This is where it's going.
I do agree. I think that they're a generation that has grown up feeling that they can reach out to people who have, however niche a passion they have, however sub-genre their genre is, they will find somebody else in the world who shares that passion, and they are connecting with them, and they're forming their own little communities around very specific artistic and cultural passions. So they don't need theatres and galleries to facilitate that conversation for them. They want to do it themselves. So as Arthur said, a top-down model doesn't make any sense to them at all. I think giving them the tools with which they can do that more successfully has got to be a good thing. But yeah, I broadly agree with everything Arthur said.
Do the Edge people want to become audience? You say they use themselves, fans, as friends.
It's a different relationship, that's for sure. I mean, if you look at the kind of evolving relationship that they have with pop stars, for example, you know, when I was a teenager in the 80s, you know, pop stars were on a pedestal, you know, Michael Jackson and Madonna and people like that. You can't have imagined of having any sort of dialogue with them. Now we've shifted towards pop stars for millennials who are perhaps seen as more approachable. You know, the Taylor Swifts of this world, the Ed Sheerans of this world, they're perhaps more approachable. But for Generation Edge, you do have pop stars and celebrities and cultural figures who feel as though they are part of their group, they're part of their friends. There's an almost complete cycle of dialogue going on between them. So I think what we really learn from this is it's about sharing, it's about giving something of yourself back to that community. And the more you do that, the bigger you get.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can see Ingrid. I guess she wants to present the lunch. Go. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you so much. Tusen takk skal dere ha. Nå det lunsj, 1 time, og så starter vi 1:15. Før vi går herfra, så vil vi gjerne bare høre hva Birger har fått ut av denne sesjonen. Birger, hvor du?
Nei, ikke faen.